In this video, I want to add a few points to the test review packet that you collected today in class. There are some updates to it I want you to be aware of before you work on it between now and next week. First off, on the front page, it should say Test 1, Review 1. The copy that I have here on my screen said assignment, but yours should say Test 1, Review 1. The first thing that I want you to note, and maybe add this to your own sheet, is that problems 1 through 12 should be completed without a calculator. When I give tests for CCP credit, tests are almost always split into calc permitted and no calc allowed, or no calc permitted portions of the test. So the questions that you see here, 1 through 12, are typical of the law of exponent questions that you'll see on the no calculator portion of the test. When we get down to problems number 13 and 14, I would say that those are calculator permitted. And that's not because I expect you to bring a calculator that can simplify this, but what you should recognize is that when simplifying using the law of exponents, say with these x's in this numerator here, when the bases multiply and we have to add the exponents together, well, sometimes adding fractions or later subtracting fractions or multiplying fractions could be a bit tricky in the heat of the moment while you're in the middle of a test. And if you want to use a calculator to assist you with the computations, I'm fine with that. This really should be a test of your understanding of the process rather than your ability to compute quickly and perhaps under pressure. Speaking of calculators, most TI calculators are okay. Other handheld calculators are fine. The only type of calculators that I don't want to see are cell phone calculators on the permitted portions of the test. So no cell phone calculators permitted next week when we take the test. I do have a handful of calculators in the classroom that are okay for to borrow, but make sure that you're comfortable using them. I don't want to provide time during the test to assist you with how to use the calculator. We can talk more about that next week when we see each other. Now, if you flip that first page over, the back side of that first page, I want you to make a note that all of these questions, or most of these questions on this next page, could show up in either the no calculator portion or the calculator permitted portion of the test. If these questions, like say 15 through 18, if they show up on the no calculator portion of the test, then I would expect you to solve them by factoring. So for example, on number 15, if this was no calculator, I would expect you to move all terms to one side of the equation like we normally would, then factor, and with those factors, identify your solutions. In this case, P equals 3 and 7. So again, you can do that without a calculator. If this question were to show up on the calculator permitted portion of the test, well, then you might use something like the quadratic formula. And here again, we can identify A, B, and C once we isolate the terms to one side of the equation. With A, B, and C known and substituting them into the quadratic formula, we could then use a calculator to simplify this quotient with the radical. So again, depending on which one you're more comfortable with and how fast that technique goes, I kind of like factoring whenever possible. But if you have a calculator in front of you and you want to use the quadratic formula for a problem like that, that would be fine. Your other option, of course, is to graph and look for x-intercepts when you graph. The problem, of course, with graphing is that if you have a graph that does not have any x-intercepts, while there are no real solutions, according to this graph. There are non-real or imaginary number solutions, and you would need to identify those as well. That's where the quadratic formula or other techniques might come into play. In the second group of instructions, I just crossed out this second half of the instructions where it says to use the quadratic formula. To be perfectly honest, if these types of questions get to be as complicated as I think they might be, it doesn't matter to me which technique you use. Quadratic formula, completing the square, graphing, etc. It won't matter to me which technique you use as long as you show your work. And since I'm not going to be real picky on which method you use, I'm again fine with saying any technique is fine. Just make sure that you show your work, or at least explain your reasoning. If you tell me you've got a solution just by mental math and you don't show any work, well, that's going to be kind of hard for me to judge. So, if you did do mental math, explain to me the type of steps that you went through to find that solution. And as long as your argument is compelling enough, I'm perfectly fine awarding full credit for that. For the bottom half of the second page, no calculator permitted on any of these. You're going to have to factor pretty regularly, especially in the denominators of expressions that look like this in the bottom right-hand corner. So factoring and finding common denominators or other techniques used to solve for an unknown variable would be employed here, but I don't think a calculator is necessary. Most of these come from part 3 from the Khan Academy selection. So make sure you go back and spend some time reviewing those. Or if you had really a tough time with part 3, then take a few questions that bothered you, write them up in an email to me, and I'll try to record a video to help you walk through them and give you more of a clarification. If these problems do continue to bother you and you don't write up an email before next week, then mark them on this sheet of paper and be sure to ask about them in class when I see you on Thursday of next week. I'll go ahead and put this up on the screen. Here's the answer key to those first set of assignments. So if you want to take a screenshot of this or refer to this section of the video to see some of those solutions, you're more than welcome to do so. I do see a lot of solutions that do contain I as an imaginary number solution, so those would be difficult to answer precisely without the quadratic formula. Also, these solutions that are precise with radicals, that would be tough to do without the quadratic formula as well. I typically don't want decimal answers if we can provide an efficient, precise answer like this. Now, if we were to switch to the second set of review problems, these are all systems of equations, and you're going to be covering this in part 4 and 5 in your work this week. So I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time talking about those. I'll specify some of the issues with them next week in class. But what I do want to point out here to finish out this video is the tentative split of our test next week. I have enough problems and questions to add up to about 130 points on this particular test, and that's pretty common. Most of my tests are worth more than 100 points, or there are more than 100 points available on each test, and some combination of those will be completed. In this case, 130 points are out there, 20 of which come from the law of exponents. That was that first page in the review packet. 65 points are going to come from